Some people grow up with a whole heap of friends. Others are lucky to have just one. I am simultaneously both. I had all kinds of friends. Jocks, geeks, band nerds, cheerleaders, mathletes. I was the kind of social glue that'd just slip into the cracks. Everywhere I went, people just opened doors for me. But in a way, I only had one friend. Gary was my complete opposite. He was introverted, dark, quiet, and, let's be real, not very liked. He was the youngest of 5 siblings, all of whom were very popular. There was a running joke that Gary was an afterthought and just given a random name, that no one really cared for him. Because of this, everyone just called him 5, or 05. To me, he was just Gary. Gary was a sad kid. Every school has one, and you just know things won't work out for them. He had trouble concentrating, trouble making friends, trouble reading, just trouble all over. It was hard to keep up with him at times, but he was also the closest friend I'd ever had. He was an amazingly attentive listener, and he had this ability to always make me see things differently. I believe that people who truly know sadness are the ones best suited to cheer you up. They know what you need to hear. So Gary and I were best friends ever since kindergarten. We did everything together. Everything from birthday parties to watching lazy Sunday cartoons after a sleepover in our pajamas. Our families were friends too, and we'd take joint trips out to Silver Bay to swim at the Black Beach. Almost half of all pictures of me as a kid have Gary poking out in the background or standing next to me, always with that same emotionless face. Still, to me, I can see what he's really feeling in those photos. It is subtle, but it is there. You just have to look at the eyes. As we grew older, things got harder. We ended up in different high schools and couldn't see each other as often. Gary started smoking, and he was more alone than ever. Without me around, people were quick to pick on him. It was brutal. The worst thing was when they covered his new sneakers in a kind of flammable skin cream. As Gary stomped out a cigarette, his shoes ignited. The fire burned his legs badly, and he had to roll around in the showers to put them out. He had to spend the night in the hospital with 2nd-degree burns and some 3rd-degree burns on 3 of his toes. I came to see him in the hospital that day. He'd been put on an intravenous line, had his legs bandaged, and given strong painkillers. No one else came to visit him. His mom had been there for a short while just to make sure her insurance covered the damages, but then she had to rush off to her second job. I was the one who spent most of the time with Gary that day, and he barely said a word. His fancy new sneakers had been left in the shower, nothing more than rags. He'd only used them for about a week. I decided I would stay there until I was done with my homework, so I didn't leave until late in the evening. Around 8 o'clock I was about to go. As I stood up, I noticed Gary just staring into the ceiling, fully awake. "I just had the most amazing dream," he muttered. I stopped, halfway out the door, and turned around. "I'm so happy. I'm just so happy," he continued. I've never felt like that." "Gary, are you okay?" I asked. He turned to me, his eyes unblinking. He had a large, wide-mouthed smile on his face. He never smiled like that. There were streaks of tears on his cheeks. "The world was ending," he said. "And right there, at the edge, she waits for me. She's right there, and I love her so much." "What was she like?" He leaned back, staring into the ceiling with a grin. "She was fucking terrifying." Over the next few weeks, Gary was a different person. Every time we met, he would just be happy. He'd be smiling, outgoing, and welcoming. It almost looked fake, like he was wearing an off-brand copy of his own face. He had to spend some time in a wheelchair to put weight off his feet, but that didn't seem to bother him. He'd spend hours on his laptop, completely consumed by whatever. He started making illustrations. Some were drawings, others were digital photo edits. They all had the same elements. The shadow of a single person, standing in front of an enormous full moon. Pieces of debris would be floating in mid-air. The same image would follow him like a ghost, and he'd depict it in 1,000 different ways. But high school doesn't last forever. We graduated in the year 2000. At the turn of the century, Gary didn't show up for his own graduation, and the last message I got from him was a simple "good luck." After that, he cut his ties with everyone and moved out of state. According to his family, he'd found some sort of job up in New Hampshire. Some online thing, they said. I think it was on a boat. Norwegian, maybe. I knew I'd miss him, but at least he seemed happy. Over the years, I've thought a lot about Gary. I've wondered about what happened to him that night in the hospital and how it changed his life. My life, however, would go a completely different way. I got married to my high school sweetheart, and we had our first kid in 2005. Our second came in 2008. For years, Gary floated out of my mind. Life has a way of making new priorities for you, whether you like it or not. As the years passed, I got a job as a warehouse manager, and my kids were growing like weeds. Amy, my wife, went through a long bout with leukemia, but we both emerged on the other side stronger than ever. Needless to say, my mysterious childhood friend wasn't the center of attention anymore. It wasn't until the start of the COVID pandemic that Gary suddenly crashed back into my life, completely by happenstance. My oldest kid, Pat, had this thing where he would surf the web with his buddies to try and find spooky things. They would share links with each other and dare one another to click. One day they got in an argument, as one of the kids kept sharing links by the same guy. There was no challenge to it. Nothing new. Pat showed me, and I was floored. It was a collection of images, poems, short stories, music, all kinds of things. It was all just terrifying. Vivid images of people disintegrating against the background of a full moon. Music that sampled screams and moans of the dead and dying. At first I thought it was all just fake, but I wasn't entirely sure. I figured it was some kind of world-building exercise. However, the name of the author was prominent in every piece of work. I'd recognize that username anywhere. 05. Gary. And many of the images looked eerily familiar. The collection was called I Love the End of the World. It was originally on Instagram, but there were links to it all over Reddit. Hell, there were TikTok reaction videos to people listening to the spooky music he'd made. I saw a clip of two young teenage girls listening to the piece Don't Blame the End, and they just broke down crying. It was just depressing. It didn't surprise me that this all came from Gary. I've seen a few of his stories right here in this subreddit, actually. I think he used to post here. On a whim, I sent him a direct message. I asked if it was really him and if he felt like catching up. About an hour later, he got back to me. Not only was it him, but he was eager to meet up. He'd come a long way from the sad kid I grew up with, and he was actually working with a small publisher to get his work out. It was all very niche, but hey, he was making good money. For his next art book, he was considering coming back to his hometown for the release party. I told him I'd be first in line. Sadly, his book release came at the height of the COVID pandemic. It was probably the worst possible timing. And Gary told me he wouldn't be doing a tour. Instead, he just wanted to visit some friends and family during his downtime. And I was the last person on that list. We reserved a date at the end of November 2020. I met Gary on a Friday afternoon in late November. After all these years, he still had that fake smile on his face. It rubbed me the wrong way, like he was hiding something. I knew what he was supposed to look like. So seeing him like that just felt disingenuous. He had lost a lot of weight over the years, but gained a lot of hair. I could have sworn he had the same kind of black clothes he did back when we were teenagers. It was the same old Gary, just new packaging. Oh, and a fancy moon-shaped belt buckle, or maybe some kind of cyclops eye. We hugged, small-talked, and got in my car. Gary pulled out a six-pack from his backpack and lit a cigarette. I didn't feel like stopping him, even though my wife would have something to say about our car smelling of tobacco. "You gotta stay in the moment," Gary smiled. "It's the end of the world, buddy." This time, his smile seemed genuine. We drove out to Silver Bay. We'd decided to have a couple of beers out on Black Beach and just chat the day away. It was perfect, in a way. Our dads would always bring a couple of beers every time they drove us out there as kids. And now we'd be the middle-aged men in the same cheap chairs. Both our families had shrunk over the years. So this was our way of paying our respects and reconnecting. All at once. Our dads weren't around anymore, and our mothers were barely the same people. Time takes its toll. Gary never had kids. He had lovers and girlfriends, but he could never commit to any of them. Instead, he just dug deep into his art, and that made him a pretty penny. Apparently, there are no less than 3 different streaming services who've bought the rights to some of his short stories, and one of his older stories was adapted as part of a horror anthology. He used a pseudonym, though. I'm sure some of you've seen it. Once we got out to Black Beach, Gary pulled out the chairs. In late November, not a lot of people go to the beach. Apart from a jogger or two or someone walking their dog, it was empty. It was just us and Lake Superior. Gary plopped down in his chair and invited me to join him. We cracked open our beers and held them up to the lake. "To the end," said Gary. "To new beginnings," I added. "Sure," he nodded. "New beginnings. Gary, I got to ask about the moon. You've been drawing the same thing for decades. Everyone always asks about the moon, you know, but it's the wrong question." "How come?" Gary turned in his seat and smiled. He glanced at me, waving his beer can around like a conducting baton. "Why does no one ask what it is? You just assume it is a moon. It isn't. Do you remember that night in the hospital?" I did, vividly. The first time I'd actually seen him smile. The same way he still did. I fell in love that night. The most beautiful woman I've ever seen. Right there, at the end of the world. How come you've never drawn her then? I always draw her. You just don't see her the way I do. I just kept silent and watched him. He rolled his eyes. "That's no moon," he said. "That's her eye." He turned back to the lake. "And it is goddamn beautiful," he added. Gary crushed his can and picked up another beer. He lit a cigarette and leaned back in his chair. "It really is the end, you know," he said. "For real." "Don't say that," I said, shaking my head now. "That's creepy." "No, she's coming. I asked her to." He snapped his fingers. Lights out. "Why would you want to end the world, Gary?" "Love, buddy," Gary smiled. "I've never really felt it. But right there with her, there it is. Just that one last perfect moment of love. That's all we can really hope for, you know. To face the end of the line just feeling complete?" "Yeah," Gary nodded. "Complete." He got up from his chair, leaving his half-full beer can behind in the sand. He walked down the beach and dipped his feet in the water. Curious, I followed him. I didn't even notice the tide growing taller, going from his feet all the way up to his knees. "I've spent all these years just trying to finish my work," Gary said. "Now I'm done, so I think it's time to go." "You're scaring me, Gary." "Look, it's not It's not something bad, right? I just wanted you here. You have to be here. You were there at the start. You got to be here at the end. Gary, look, you... I stopped mid-sentence. Just inches away from my face, I saw it. A small seashell, floating in mid-air. All around me, tiny pieces of debris rose from the ground. I couldn't breathe. I was trying to inhale, but all my body wanted was to scream. My lungs locked up. I could see Gary's feet lifting from the ground. Nothing but the tip of his toes was even touching the black sand. He held out his hands, just like the silhouette in his old drawings. "I'm so glad we got to be here together," Gary said. "I've called out to her, and she's coming." What are you?" I forced air into my lungs, choking on a few grains of sand. I started coughing, my eyes watering. The hair on my arm was standing up. I felt a sudden cold, followed by a searing warmth. I opened my eyes and was met with the brightness of a full moon rising out of the dark waters. Gary was right. That was no moon. A single pale eye, more like a luminescent diamond. It was blindingly bright, casting a vague hint of the body attached to it in the darkness behind it. Chunks of sand were falling into the ocean, breaking the surface in thick splotches. It was at least 25 feet tall and still rising out of the sand. I was just seeing the head. Gary was entranced, smiling from ear to ear. Finally, he was happy. I had to do something. It felt like dream logic at the time. I wasn't thinking rationally. A part of my reptile brain was trying to convince me to do something insane. But seeing this thing rise out of the water threw all rationality to the wind. I couldn't solve this problem with a sane mind, so something in me turned alien. I snatched a broken seashell out of the air. The thing was sharp as a knife, and as I stared into the pale eye, I pushed the shell into my arm. Gary turned his head to me, shocked. "What are you—" "No! Stop it!" he yelled. I barely even felt anything. My heart was racing so fast that I was losing all blood in my hands and feet. I just started cutting. "Stop! Please! You got to see this." I saw drops of blood floating out of me. Gary's feet dropped back into the sand as he hurried over to me. In a matter of seconds, my manic cutting was making me pass out. The last thing I remember is feeling the sand turn warm from my blood. My logic was insane, but simple. I had to be there at the end. If I wasn't alive by then, it wouldn't work. Gary, crazy as he may be, loves me too much not to have me there. I might be the only thing he cares about, apart from the end itself. So taking me out of the picture, well, that would at least buy us some time. I only have flashes of what happened afterward. I remember Gary crying, and an ambulance. Sirens, people asking me to look into a light. A bumpy ride and a hard hospital bed. The next morning my family was by my side, and Gary was wanted by the police. They thought he attacked me, and I didn't know how to tell them what really happened. I had plenty of stitches, but my arm would be fine far faster than my eyes were. Staring into that blinding light burned something into my retinas, and I still haven't completely recovered. I haven't seen Gary since then. All I have left from him is a piece of paper he stuck in my pants. "See you at the end, buddy." I haven't been able to explain to anyone what really happened that night or what I saw. I have this feeling that Gary is going to come back someday. He's not going to give up on the only true love of his life. Next time, I don't think he'll take any chances. He'll keep me alive, and he'll make me watch. So, for when that day comes, I've got a gun. It's right here. If push comes to shove, I'll stop this. Him or me, someone has to go. I love the guy, but what he showed me is beyond my wildest nightmares. That was the end. The actual end. I was literally staring it in the face. And I lived. I know Gary checks these subreddits, and I wanted to tell the real story behind his work. So for those fans of his that are still out there, just step away for a while. There are other things than horror out there. Enjoy it all. There will be plenty of horrors in the end.